The kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. One sentence. And inside that one sentence is one of the most universally accessible images Jesus ever used, because anyone who lived on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in the first century knew nets, knew fish, knew the work of separating what was good from what was not after a full night of fishing. But what almost nobody notices is that this parable is not about fish. It is about what you do with everything the net brings in. And 2,000 years after this story was told, we live in a moment when the largest net ever built by humanity casts its threads over every waking person on the planet, capturing everything without distinction, the true and the false, the building and the destructive, what liberates and what imprisons. We call that net the internet. And the question Jesus asked at the edge of the Sea of Galilee has never been more urgent than it is today. What are you doing with what the net captured? To understand this parable in its full depth, we first need to understand the world where it was born. And that world was made of water, of nets, of sleepless nights, and of fish that needed to be sorted before the sun grew too hot. We are at the edge of the Sea of Galilee, somewhere between the years 30 and 33 after Christ. The lake is approximately 21 kilometers long and 13 kilometers wide at its widest point. It is not small, it is not a pond. It is a body of water with currents, with varying depths, with microclimates that can transform a calm morning into an afternoon storm within hours. And it was, in the first century, one of the most productive fishing ecosystems in the entire eastern Mediterranean region. The historical records of the period, including the writings of the first-century historian Flavius Josephus, describe the Sea of Galilee as a lake of extraordinary fishing wealth, with entire communities of fishermen established along its shores, an active industry of fish processing and salting, particularly in the city of Magdala, known in Aramaic as Tarichaea, which literally means the place where fish are salted, and established commercial routes that carried processed fish to Jerusalem and beyond. Fishing was not a marginal activity in first-century Galilee. It was one of the main sources of protein and income in the region. And Galilean fishermen were not occasional workers. They were professionals with specialized knowledge, with sophisticated equipment by the standards of the time, with networks of commercial relationships, and with an intimate understanding of fish behavior, lake currents, and seasonal cycles that determined where and when to fish. When Jesus mentions a net let down into the lake, he is using the Greek word Sagene, and that word does not describe just any net. It describes specifically a dragnet, a type of fishing equipment very different from the circular casting nets that individual fishermen threw from the shore. The Sagene was a long net, frequently hundreds of meters in length, with weights along the lower edge that made it sink, and floaters along the upper edge that kept it vertical in the water, forming a submerged curtain that would sweep the bottom of the lake while being dragged by two boats operating in parallel. When the two boats converged and the fishermen pulled the net toward the shore or into the boats, they brought with them everything in the path. There was no selection during the fishing. The net did not choose. The net captured. This is fundamentally different from other fishing methods that existed in the first century. A fisherman with a hook chooses the bait. A fisherman with a casting net has some capacity to aim at a specific school of fish, but the Sagene, the dragnet, was by definition inclusive. It caught large fish and small fish, fish that were edible and fish that were not edible under Jewish law, aquatic plants, shells, gravel, and occasionally objects that had fallen into the lake. Italian researcher Chiara Mariani, specialist in fishing archaeology of the ancient Mediterranean world at the Università degli Studi di Bari, documented in her work on fishing methods in the Sea of Galilee during the Roman period that the dragnet was the most productive method in terms of gross capture volume, but also the one that required the greatest subsequent sorting work. She writes that the archaeological evidence found at fishing sites along the shores of the Sea of Galilee includes large quantities of scales and bones from multiple species, including species that were not considered kosher under Jewish law, which confirms that the sorting of the catch after capture was an essential and regular step in the fishing process in that region. Matthew records the parable in just 3 verses. It is one of the shortest in the entire collection. The kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. 3 verses, 1 image, 1 interpretation, and an ending that feels more severe than most modern listeners expect from Jesus. But before arriving at the ending, we need to understand what happens in the middle. Because it is in the middle that the parable says the most important thing. The net was cast. The net caught all kinds of fish. The net was pulled to the shore. And then, sitting down, the fishermen sorted. Sitting down. Scottish theologian Ian Howard Marshall, Professor Emeritus of New Testament Exegesis at the University of Aberdeen and one of the most respected British specialists in gospel hermeneutics, observes in his commentary on Matthew that the detail of the fishermen sitting is not ornamental. In the world of manual labor in the 1st century, sitting to perform a task indicated that the task required careful attention and deliberate judgment. It was not hurried work. It was work of discernment. The fishermen did not throw the bad fish away carelessly while rushing to another activity. They sat down, they looked, they evaluated, and then they decided. But what exactly were the bad fish? Here is one of the most culturally specific elements of the entire parable, and one of the most ignored by modern interpretations. Jewish law, in the book of Leviticus and in the book of Deuteronomy, established very clear criteria about which aquatic animals were considered clean and could be eaten. The rule was relatively simple. Aquatic animals with fins and scales were considered clean. Those without fins and scales were unclean. The Sea of Galilee housed a wide variety of species. Some were clearly kosher. The fish known today as St. Peter's fish, scientifically known as Sarotherodon galileus, and still found in the lake today, was one of the most caught and traded species. Other species, such as the catfish of the Clariida family, which are bottom-dwelling fish without scales, were considered unclean and could not be consumed by observant Jews. Israeli archaeologist Mendel Nun, who spent decades studying fishing on the Sea of Galilee and whose research is considered fundamental reference for understanding fishing in the Second Temple period, documented that the Dragnet regularly captured at least 22 different species of fish in the lake, in addition to other aquatic organisms. Of all those species, only some were considered kosher and therefore commercially valuable for the Jewish market. The rest needed to be separated and discarded. This means that for a 1st century Jewish Galilean fisherman, sorting the catch from the Dragnet was not simply a matter of fish size or quality. It was a matter of ritual purity. It was a religious obligation. It was an integral part of the identity of who he was as a Jew and as a professional. The separation of the fish was not an optional task. It was necessary, it was inevitable, and it was work that required real knowledge of which species were which. Israeli specialist in New Testament and Second Temple Judaism Shmuel Safrai, professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and author of foundational works on Jewish society in the Roman period, argues in his writings on daily life in 1st century Palestine that the familiarity of Jesus' listeners with the fish sorting process made this parable immediately comprehensible in its most specific details. Safrai documents that the separation of kosher fish from non-kosher fish was a visible and public process in the fishing communities on the shores of the lake, an activity that any Galilean inhabitant, even those who were not fishermen, had witnessed repeatedly throughout their lives. This is crucial for understanding why Jesus chose this image. He was not using an abstract metaphor about something his listeners needed to imagine. He was pointing to something they had seen with their own eyes, something that was happening in that same lake reflecting the sun while he spoke. Everyone who heard Jesus at that moment already knew how the story ended, already knew that the net captures everything, already knew that the separation comes afterward, already knew that it is the work of the fishermen sitting on the shore that determines what goes into the basket and what is discarded. Jesus was not revealing a new truth. He was asking them to see the truth they already knew with different eyes. But there is a dimension of this parable that goes beyond the practical religious sorting of fish, and that German theologian Joachim Jeremias, considered one of the greatest 20th century specialists in the parables of Jesus, identified as central to understanding the narrative purpose of the parable within Jesus' ministry. Jeremias observed that the parable of the net, together with the parable of the wheat and the tares that we will examine in our next episode, belongs to a specific group of parables that Jesus told in response to an implicit or explicit criticism of his ministry. The criticism was this: why did Jesus receive sinners? Why did he eat with tax collectors? Why did he allow people of questionable reputation to approach him? Why did he not pre-select who could be a disciple? The answer of Jesus, through these parables, was simple and radical at the same time. The net does not sort while it fishes. The sorting happens afterward, and it is not the fisherman who sorts during the fishing. It is the fisherman who sits on the shore after the net has already been pulled in. The ministry of Jesus was the net, inclusive by design, comprehensive by intention, capturing all who were in its path, those whom religious culture considered good, and those whom religious culture considered bad, without distinction during the process of drawing near. The separation, the parable says explicitly, will come afterward, and it will not be done by human fishermen. It will be done by angels at the end of time. This has enormous implications for how the Christian community should see and organize itself in the present time. Theologian and professor of New Testament at the University of Durham in England, John Barclay, specialist in Paul and in the social context of early Christianity, examines that dimension of the parable in his writings on the sociology of the first Christian communities. Barclay argues that the parable of the net establishes a fundamental principle about the nature of the Christian community in the present time. It is by definition a mixed community, not because it is careless or indifferent to holiness, but because the time of final judgment has not yet come. And to anticipate that judgment, excluding beforehand those who seem not to belong, is to assume a function that the parable explicitly reserves for the angels at the end of time. This does not mean there are no standards. It does not mean any behavior is acceptable. It means that the posture of the community during the time of fishing is different from the posture there will be at the time of final separation. And confusing those two moments, acting as if the final separation had already arrived, is to fundamentally distort what the parable is describing. And now we need to talk about the largest net ever built by humanity. It is not made of fiber. It is not dragged by boats. It does not catch fish. But it catches attention. It catches belief. It catches identity. It catches what people think is true about themselves, about the world, about others, and about God. We call that net the Internet. And in 2026, it casts its threads over approximately 5,300,000,000 connected people around the planet. The problem is not the net itself. The problem is exactly the same one that Galilean fishermen faced after pulling the Sagene to the shore. The net captured everything, the good and the bad, the true and the false, the building and the destructive, what nourishes and what poisons. And the urgent question is, who is sitting on the shore doing the work of sorting? British researcher Gordon Pennycook, professor of behavioral psychology at the University of Regina in Canada, and one of the most cited researchers in the world on disinformation and analytical reasoning, published a series of studies in recent years that document with precision what happens when people receive information without doing the work of sorting. Pennycook and his collaborators found that the primary variable determining whether a person will believe and share false information is not their intelligence or level of education. It is their willingness to stop and think before reacting. People who have developed the habit of pausing, questioning, and verifying before sharing are significantly less susceptible to disinformation, regardless of their academic background. And people who consume information reflexively and automatically, without the deliberate work of sorting, are equally susceptible to disinformation regardless of their intelligence. In other words, the work of separating the good from the bad is not automatic. It is a choice. It is a habit. It is exactly the work of the fishermen sitting on the shore. In 2026, the problem of fake news and digital disinformation reached dimensions that researchers who had been studying the topic a decade ago could not fully anticipate. The emergence of generative artificial intelligence tools capable of producing text, image, audio, and video of quality indistinguishable from human-produced content created an environment where authenticity verification became exponentially more difficult. Videos of political leaders saying things they never said, images of events that never happened, scientific articles fabricated with plausible but non-existent references, testimonies of real people altered to communicate messages they never delivered. The net captures all of that together, without distinction, without prior warning. without a classification label, and the volume is of such magnitude that no automatic verification system can keep pace. The Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, affiliated with the University of Oxford, published in its annual report for 2025 that the volume of potentially misleading content circulating on social media had grown by more than 300% in the preceding 3 years, driven primarily by the proliferation of generative artificial intelligence tools accessible to the general public. 300% in 3 years. The net grew larger, the capture became more voluminous, and the sorting work became proportionally more urgent. Israeli historian and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari, professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and author of widely translated works on the history and future of humanity, wrote in his most recent works about what he calls the crisis of shared reality. Harari argues that societies function when there is a minimum base of shared facts upon which people can disagree, but which serve as common ground for dialogue. When that base fragments, when different groups inhabit completely distinct and incompatible universes of facts, the capacity to resolve conflicts through dialogue and negotiation collapses. What he documents in his most recent works is that social media and the proliferation of disinformation are eroding that shared base in an accelerated and systematic way, and that the result is not simply that people disagree more, it is that people inhabit different realities, and that this fragmentation has consequences that go far beyond politics, affecting social cohesion, the capacity for collective response to crises, and the very experience of belonging to a community. The net captures everything, and when nobody sits on the shore to do the sorting, the result is not neutrality, it is confusion, it is fragmentation. It is the impossibility of building something common on a foundation that nobody can discern anymore. Returning to the first century, there is an element of the parable that deserves special attention and that rarely receives the treatment it merits. Jesus did not leave the parable without explanation. Unlike many other parables he told to the crowds without offering interpretation, the parable of the net belongs to the same block of Matthew chapter 13 that includes the parable of the wheat and the tares, and Jesus interprets it directly for his disciples. The interpretation is direct and unambiguous. The net is the present time of the world. The fish of all kinds are people of every origin and condition. The shore where the net is pulled is the end of time. The fishermen who sit down are the angels. And the final separation between the good and the bad is the judgment of God. Italian theologian Rinaldo Fabris, Professor Emeritus of New Testament Exegesis at the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome, and one of the most respected Catholic commentators on the Gospel of Matthew, examines that interpretation by Jesus and observes something that most readers pass over unnoticed. Fabris notes that Jesus, in interpreting the parable, deliberately shifts the focus of the identity of the fisherman. During the parable, the fishermen are those who fish. In the interpretation, those who separate are the angels. That shift is not narrative carelessness. It is an implicit instruction about the role of the human community in the present time. Human beings are called to cast the net, to fish, to include, to draw near. The final work of separation is not human, it is divine. And to anticipate that separation, assuming the role of the angels before the designated time, is to exceed the authority the parable assigns to humanity at this moment in history. But there is a real tension that this parable leaves incompletely resolved, and which the contemporary context makes even more acute. If the final separation is the work of angels and not of humans, what do we do with the sorting of information we need to do every day? The answer lies in a distinction the parable suggests without explicitly stating. There is a difference between sorting the fish from the net and sorting the net itself. The parable speaks about the final separation of people within human history, the eschatological judgment of who belongs to the kingdom of God and who does not. That judgment is reserved for God. But the sorting of what enters your personal information net, what you read, what you believe, what you share, what you allow to shape your worldview, that sorting is not a judgment of other people. It is personal responsibility for your own mind and your own heart. The Galilean fishermen did not judge the bad fish. They simply did not put them in the basket. It was not cruelty. It was discernment about what nourished and what did not. American researcher Dana Boyd, founder of the Data and Society Research Institute and one of the most respected global researchers on digital media and online behavior, argues in her works on media literacy that the central problem of information consumption in the digital age is not the lack of information, it is the lack of sorting skills. Boyd documents that people exposed to larger volumes of information without the corresponding skills of critical evaluation do not become better informed. They become more confused, more anxious, and more susceptible to simple narratives that offer certainty in the midst of confusion. The solution she proposes is not to consume less information, but to actively develop what she calls fisherman skills, the capacity to evaluate the origin, the consistency, the evidence, and the motivations behind each piece of information that enters the net before deciding whether it goes in the basket or gets discarded. Fisherman skills. The image is exact. And 2,000 years before Dana Boyd coined that concept, Jesus described it sitting by the Sea of Galilee. But there is yet another dimension of this analogy that deserves exploration. The parable says that when the net was full, the fishermen pulled it to the shore. When it was full, not when it contained the right fish, not when the catch was entirely kosher species. When it was full, when there was sufficient volume to justify the work of pulling and sorting. This suggests that the fullness of the capture precedes the discernment of separation, that you first need to let the net do its work, of capturing broadly, before doing the work of sorting carefully. Applied to information consumption, this has an important counterintuitive implication. The problem is not exposure to diversity of perspectives, sources, and types of information. The problem is the absence of the subsequent sorting work. A person who consumes only pre-selected information that confirms what they already believe is not doing the work of the fishermen sitting on the shore. They are simply preventing the net from being cast. The richness of the Dragnet was precisely its capacity to capture broadly. The skill of the fisherman was in the work that came afterward. Israeli neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene, professor at the Collège de France in Paris and director of Neurospin, one of the most advanced neuroimaging research centers in the world, has spent decades researching the brain mechanisms of learning, reading, and critical thinking. In his most recent works on how the brain processes information in high-speed and high-volume environments, Dehaene documents that the human brain has two information processing systems that operate in parallel. The first is fast, automatic, pattern-based, emotionally reactive, and highly susceptible to biases. The second is slow, deliberate, analytical, demanding in terms of cognitive energy, and capable of evaluating evidence more objectively. The information consumption environment of social media in 2026 was designed, frequently in an intentional and explicit way by its creators, to activate the first system and suppress the second. Speed, volume, emotional reactivity, immediate engagement rewards, all of these characteristics of the digital environment favor the fast and automatic system over the slow and deliberate one. The work of the fisherman sitting on the shore requires the second system. It requires slowness. It requires deliberation. It requires the willingness not to react immediately to what the net captured, but to examine carefully before deciding what goes into the basket. And developing that habit, consistently and consciously, in an environment designed to prevent it, is one of the greatest challenges of human formation in the 21st century. Let us return to the Sea of Galilee. There is something in the scene Matthew describes that goes beyond the practical sorting of fish. There is something about the posture of the fishermen that carries a message, not explicitly articulated in the parable, but present in the image. They sat down, after a full night of fishing, after the effort of dragging the net to the shore, after the fatigue of the intense physical work that dragnet fishing required. They sat down and did the work of discernment. The sorting was not the glamorous work, it was the work after the work. It did not have the adrenaline of active fishing, did not have the immediate satisfaction of seeing the full net rising from the waters. It was the patient, meticulous, repetitive work of picking up one fish at a time and deciding basket or discard. Rabbi and Talmud scholar Adin Steinsaltz, considered one of the greatest interpreters of rabbinic literature in the 20th century, and whose annotated edition of the Talmud is a worldwide reference in Jewish studies, wrote in his essays on spiritual discernment that the Jewish tradition deeply values what is called Bedikat Shametz, the searching and elimination of leavened bread before Passover, as a metaphor for the spiritual work of examining what is within oneself and eliminating what corrupts. Steinsaltz argues that this work of deliberate interior inspection, of carefully examining what has entered and deciding what stays and what goes, is one of the most fundamental spiritual practices in the Jewish tradition, and that it requires exactly the posture of the fisherman in the parable of Jesus. Sit down, examine, judge carefully without rushing, without automatism. There is one final element of the parable that most contemporary readings tend to soften or avoid because of its apparently severe tone: the ending. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That language is strong, deliberately strong, and it serves a specific function within the structure of the parable that cannot be ignored without impoverishing the text. The language of fire and weeping is not apocalyptic decoration. It is the affirmation that what happens to what is separated has real and permanent consequences. That sorting is not merely a matter of organization or efficiency. That something is genuinely at stake in the distinction between the good and the bad. For Galilean fishermen, discarding the unclean fish was not simply a matter of gastronomic preference. It was a religious obligation with real consequences for the ritual purity of whoever consumed them. The discard protected something real. The sorting carried real weight. What you choose to believe shapes what you think. What you think shapes what you do. What you do shapes who you become. And who you become determines how you affect the people around you. The discard of bad fish was not cruelty toward the fish. It was protection of what went into the basket, into the family, into the community. The discernment about what you allow to enter through your information net is not intellectual arrogance. It is responsibility for what will nourish your mind, your faith, your relationships, and your capacity to contribute to the common good. And then we arrive back at the beginning. The kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. The net of the kingdom is inclusive by design. It reaches everyone. It does not pre-select based on appearance, reputation, religious history, or social category. It casts its threads broadly over all who are in its path and brings them to the shore. And it is on the shore that the human work of discernment happens, not the final judgment that belongs to God, but the daily and necessary work of examining what has come in, of sitting carefully and attentively and deciding what goes into the basket and what goes to the discard. That work has never been easy. In first-century Galilee, it required knowledge of which species were which, of which were kosher and which were not, of which were fresh and which had spoiled. In 2026, it requires different but equally specific skills: the capacity to verify sources, to identify biases, to recognize emotional manipulation, to distinguish evidence from opinion, to pause before reacting, to ask before sharing. In both cases, the work requires the fisherman to sit down. It requires slowness. It requires attention. It requires the kind of deliberate discernment that the digital environment of our time was designed to make difficult. But it is work that needs to be done, because the net captures everything. It always did. It always will. And what goes into the basket depends on who is willing to sit on the shore and do the work. If this journey back to the first century touched something in you, leave a comment telling us what you recognized in your own way of consuming information. We read every single one. Next time, we are going to reconstruct the world of the parable of the wheat and the tares. A well-planted wheat field, an enemy who comes in the dead of night and sows weeds among the wheat, and a surprising decision by the owner of the field that changes everything we think we know about patience, judgment, and the time in which we live. But when you understand what tares were in the agricultural world of first-century Palestine, why it was virtually impossible to distinguish them from wheat during most of the growing period, and why the instruction not to pull the weeds before the harvest was not simply agricultural strategy, but a profound theological statement about the nature of the present time, you will discover that this parable is not about passive tolerance of evil. It is about the danger of trusting too much in our own capacity to see who is wheat and who is tares. If you want to keep traveling back in time to understand Scripture the way its first listeners did, subscribe. Every episode, we go deeper.